My son betrayed his own brother, then got betrayed himself. When he came crawling back, one phone call changed everything. It all started with my younger son, Jared, and the choices he made, choices that shattered our family into pieces. Looking back, I still struggle to wrap my head around how things unraveled the way they did. But before I get ahead of myself, let me give you some background so everything makes sense. For as long as I can remember, our family was tightly knit. We weren't just relatives, we were a team. Sunday dinners were a standing tradition, holidays were spent together without question, and every year, we took a family vacation, something we all looked forward to. My wife and I raised our boys with strong values, believing we had done our best to shape them into good, responsible men. Our eldest, Simon, was the kind of son any parent would be proud of. About 7 years ago, he married his college sweetheart, Tessa. They were one of those couples you read about in love stories, high school sweethearts who had grown up together, supported each other, and built a life that, from the outside, seemed nothing short of perfect. They settled into a beautiful home, started a family, and lived what many would call a dream life. Simon took everything we taught him to heart. He was dedicated to his work, loyal to his family, and always the responsible older brother, the kind of man who put others before himself. Then there was Jared. Jared was different. Where Simon was steady and focused, Jared was restless and impulsive. He had always been the charming one, the kind of guy who could talk his way out of just about anything. He made friends easily, thrived in social settings, and never seemed to take life too seriously. While Simon worked hard to build a stable future, Jared was busy chasing the thrill of the moment. He bounced from one relationship to the next, never settling down, and carried a bit of a wild streak that kept us on our toes. Still, despite his reckless nature, we never imagined he would make choices that would tear our family apart. 2 years ago, Jared met Melanie, a woman who, for a time, seemed like she could be the one to ground him. She was kind, patient, and understanding, all the things Jared wasn't. She balanced him out in a way that gave us hope. For the first time, it looked like he might finally be ready to grow up. They had a small, intimate wedding just over a year ago, and for a while, things seemed good. We thought maybe, just maybe, marriage would help him mature. But that hope didn't last long. It wasn't long before Jared started slipping back into old habits. He was restless again, disappearing for hours, sometimes even days, with little explanation. He always had some excuse, needing space, needing time to think, but we could see the toll it was taking on Melanie. She loved him, she wanted their marriage to work, and she was doing everything she could to hold on. We knew she didn't deserve what was happening, but none of us realized just how deep the damage really ran. Then, 2 months ago, everything came crashing down. Simon showed up at our house one evening, looking like he had the weight of the world on his shoulders. His face was pale, his hands shook, and his voice was thick with something I had never heard from him before, heartbreak. He had discovered something devastating. Tessa, his wife, the woman he had trusted without question, was having an affair. At first, he didn't know who the other man was. He had noticed her becoming distant, secretive, nothing like the woman he had spent years building a life with. Simon had always trusted Tessa, never doubting her late nights or sudden out-of-town trips. But then he found messages on her phone vague enough to hide the full truth, but suggestive enough to confirm his worst fears. At the same time, Melanie was reaching her own breaking point. She had spent months trying to hold on to a marriage that felt like it was slipping through her fingers. Jared was distant, distracted, constantly coming and going without explanation. She could feel something was wrong, but every time she asked, he brushed it off. Until one night, when she finally cornered him. She asked him straight up if he was seeing someone else. At first, Jared tried to lie. He gave her some nonsense about being overwhelmed at work, about needing space, about feeling trapped. But Melanie didn't let up. She kept pushing, kept demanding the truth, and eventually, after a tense, tear-filled argument, he cracked. He admitted it. Not only had he been cheating on her, but the woman he had been sneaking around with was Tessa, Simon's wife. That moment changed everything. Melanie was blindsided. The betrayal itself was already unbearable, but the fact that it was Tessa? That made it 1,000 times worse. She felt humiliated, deceived, completely shattered. She had believed in Jared, supported him, given him every chance, and this was how he repaid her. It didn't take long for all the pieces to fall into place. Simon's growing suspicions, Melanie's confrontation, everything pointed to the same ugly truth. Tessa and Jared had been sneaking around behind their spouses' backs for months. But as shocking as that was, what stunned us even more was their reaction when they were finally caught. They weren't sorry. Not even a little. Instead of apologizing, instead of showing even a shred of remorse, they actually tried to justify what they had done. Jared had the audacity to say that he and Tessa had found a connection too strong to ignore, that their love was something real, something meant to be. He went on about how true love couldn't be denied, as if that somehow excused the destruction they had caused. Tessa, on the other hand, insisted that her marriage to Simon had been falling apart long before the affair started. She claimed Jared understood her in ways Simon never could, as if that somehow made it okay. It was as if, in their minds, their feelings gave them a free pass to destroy 2 marriages. Did they really believe that? Did they honestly think their so-called love justified the betrayal, the heartbreak, the wreckage they had left behind? It was infuriating. They didn't seem to grasp the gravity of what they had done. They weren't thinking about Simon, about Melanie, about the families they had torn apart. All they cared about was each other. It was as if the rest of us, our feelings, our pain, were nothing more than collateral damage in their selfish pursuit of happiness. This wasn't just an affair. This was a betrayal on the deepest level. Jared didn't just cheat on his wife, he destroyed his own brother. He tore apart the one person who had always been there for him, who had always had his back. Simon was crushed. Completely wrecked. He had lost everything in one fell swoop, the woman he had loved and the brother he had trusted more than anyone. There was no coming back from this. Simon ended his marriage with Tessa immediately. And as for Jared? Simon cut him off entirely. Our family was never the same again. My wife and I were devastated. We could hardly believe what Jared had done, and even if we could, we didn't know how to move forward. Our family, our once close-knit, unshakable family, was shattered. Simon was the first to leave. He couldn't bear to stay in the home he had built with Tessa, so he packed up and moved out, taking the kids with him. Since then, we haven't seen much of him. He's been trying to heal, but it's been a long, painful process. Meanwhile, Jared wasted no time moving in with Tessa, turning their affair into a full-blown, out-in-the-open relationship. As parents, my wife and I were caught in the middle of something we never imagined facing. The betrayal itself was unbearable, but what made it worse was the crushing sense of failure. Where had we gone wrong? How had our son, the boy we raised, the young man we had believed in, turned into someone capable of doing this? How could he betray his own brother, his own wife, without a second thought? We asked ourselves these questions over and over, but no answer ever felt sufficient. It wasn't just Simon and Melanie who had been wronged, it was all of us. We had lost the family we once were. The fallout was swift. Simon didn't just leave Tessa, he erased her from his life. He abandoned the house, leaving everything behind except the kids. He wanted no part of their shared life anymore. Melanie, too, was blindsided. She packed up her things and went back to her parents, trying to make sense of the wreckage Jared had left in her life. And yet, through all of this, Jared and Tessa carried on without a shred of shame. As the weeks passed, things only grew more strained. Simon distanced himself from the family, refusing to be anywhere near Jared. Even hearing Jared's name was too much for him. Melanie cut off all communication with Jared, ignoring every call, every message, every pathetic attempt he made to explain himself. My wife and I were stuck in an impossible position. We loved our sons, both of them, but how could we reconcile that love with the anger, the disappointment, the grief of what Jared had done? We tried reaching out to Simon, trying to be there for him, but he kept us at arm's length. I understood why. He wasn't just grieving his marriage, he was grieving his family, the one that was supposed to always be there for him. And Jared? Jared and Tessa had the audacity to flaunt their relationship as if they hadn't just burned everything to the ground. They posted on social media, writing about their true love, making it seem like they had overcome some great obstacle to be together. As if their love story was something to be admired instead of condemned. They acted like people would eventually get over it, like time would smooth over the wreckage and everyone would just move on. But that was never going to happen. The betrayal ran too deep, the wounds were too raw. Whenever we tried to talk to Jared, to make him see the damage he had caused, he would brush it off. He insisted he was in love, and that was all that mattered. He refused to acknowledge the pain he had inflicted, refused to see how his actions had destroyed not just Simon and Melanie, but the entire foundation of our family. Then, 2 months into their happily ever after, Jared got a taste of his own medicine. Tessa left him. For another man. According to her, this new guy was her real true love. And just like that, Jared, who had given up everything for her, was discarded like he meant nothing. But she didn't just leave him. She took him for everything he had. She drained his bank account. Took his belongings. Wiped him clean. He had sacrificed his marriage, his brother, and his family for her, and in return, she left him with absolutely nothing. It was as if karma had come knocking, and it wasn't gentle. Suddenly, Jared was the one who was devastated. The one who was lost, alone, broken. He came crawling back to us, looking for sympathy, claiming he had been manipulated and used. He wanted forgiveness. Not just from us, but from Simon too. He begged for another chance to be a brother again. He wanted all of us, including Melanie, to somehow understand that he had been a victim in all of this. He wanted us to pretend like none of it had ever happened. But how could we? My wife and I were torn. On one hand, Jared was still our son. No matter what he had done, we couldn't erase our love for him. But on the other hand, how could we help him without betraying Simon and Melanie all over again? How could we just let him back into our lives after all the pain he had caused? Simon was still healing, and the last thing he needed was Jared reappearing, asking for forgiveness without even beginning to make things right. Melanie was trying to move forward, piecing her life back together after the devastation Jared left behind. Dragging her back into this mess felt cruel. And Jared? He claimed he had learned his lesson, that he deserved a chance to prove himself. But I wasn't sure he truly understood the destruction he had left in his wake. My wife believed we should support him, help him get back on his feet. But I struggled with it. I didn't know if I could. I didn't know if I should. And I didn't know if that made me wrong. Was I a bad father for not wanting to give Jared another chance? For not wanting to open our arms to him after everything he had done? Or was it justified to keep him at a distance, to let him face the consequences of his own actions? I turned to Reddit for advice, and the response was overwhelming. People shared their thoughts, their own experiences, their insight. And after reading through hundreds of comments, I realized I needed to have a conversation with Simon. I needed to hear from him directly before making any decision about Jared. So I reached out. When we sat down to talk, Simon didn't hesitate. He made it very clear, he wanted nothing to do with Jared. He didn't sugarcoat it, didn't soften the blow. I could see the pain in his eyes as he spoke, the weight he was still carrying. He told me that while he was doing his best to move forward, the wound was still fresh. Every single day was a struggle, waking up, going through the motions, trying to find a way to heal with this gaping hole where his trust and happiness used to be. But what hurt him the most wasn't just the affair. It was that it was Jared. The brother he had protected. The brother he had supported through everything. The brother he had loved and trusted more than anyone else in the world. And Jared had destroyed that bond without a second thought. Simon told me he had started seeing a therapist to help him work through everything, to try to rebuild his life. But the last thing he needed was Jared forcing his way back into it. Because every time Simon saw Jared, he was reminded of everything he had lost. The images of Jared and Tessa together, laughing, living their lives without a care while Simon suffered, still haunt him. He told me they play in his mind constantly, like a wound that refuses to heal. He's been doing everything he can to find peace, to move forward, but Jared's existence is a constant reminder of the betrayal. No matter how much distance he puts between himself and the situation, the damage is still there, lingering beneath the surface. Then Simon shared something that broke me even further. I could see it in his face, in the way his shoulders slumped, in the exhaustion that had settled into his very being. He was drowning under the weight of everything. The memories, the betrayal, the sheer responsibility of being a single father. He looked like he hadn't had a full night's rest in weeks. The toll this had taken on him was obvious, and as his father, I felt helpless. I wanted to do something, anything, to ease his burden. So I made an offer. I told him that if he needed a break, my wife and I could take the kids for a little while. Maybe some time to himself would help clear his mind, give him a chance to breathe without the constant weight of responsibility pressing down on him. I thought space might be what he needed. But Simon shook his head. He told me, without hesitation, that his kids were the only thing keeping him grounded. That if they weren't around, his mind would spiral. They were his anchor, his lifeline. Their laughter, their routines, even the smallest demands of everyday life, they gave him a reason to keep going, to stay present. The thought of being without them, even for a short while, was unbearable to him. Hearing this only deepened my concern. Simon was holding on to his kids with everything he had, and while I understood why, I worried about the way he was carrying. It was clear that being a father wasn't just a duty for him, it was his way of surviving. The pain was overwhelming, but his children gave him purpose, something to hold on to when everything else felt lost. Then he told me something else. Tessa had reached out to him. She had the audacity to try and make amends, to explain herself. At first, she sent messages apologizing, but soon those apologies twisted into justifications. She told Simon that she and Jared were meant to be, that their connection was special, something beyond his understanding. Turns out, things hadn't worked out with the guy she left Jared for either. Another true love that turned out to be nothing more than a fantasy. Ironic, isn't it? Simon saw right through her. He told me it felt like she was trying to manipulate him all over again, twisting reality to suit her own narrative. But he wasn't falling for it this time. He had nothing left to say to her. He made it clear that their relationship was beyond repair, and to ensure she didn't worm her way back into his life, he blocked her on every platform. Hearing all of this from Simon solidified what I already knew in my heart: bringing Jared back into his life would only make things worse. The wounds hadn't even begun to close, and any attempt to force reconciliation would only deepen the pain. Simon was working hard to heal. Therapy was helping him set boundaries, prioritize himself, and rediscover who he was outside of all this betrayal. He had started hiking, painting, small things that gave him a sense of peace, of control. He was even thinking about leaving the city, starting fresh somewhere new, far from all the painful memories. The last thing he needed was Jared showing up and tearing open old wounds. After that conversation, I felt even more conflicted. As a father, my instinct was to protect and support my children. But how do you do that when one of them has caused so much irreparable harm? I needed to talk to my wife. She had been more sympathetic toward Jared than I had. Not because she excused what he did, but because he was still our son. No matter how badly he had screwed up, she couldn't bring herself to turn her back on him completely. She wanted to see him happy again, stable, back on his feet. When I told her about my conversation with Simon, I could see the impact it had on her. Her face fell. She hadn't fully grasped just how deeply Simon was still hurting. I think she had hoped that with enough time, the wounds would heal and our family could somehow find its way back together. But now, even she was starting to realize that wasn't possible. She broke down, admitting that she felt like she was losing both of our sons, one to anger and heartbreak, the other to his own reckless decisions. We both knew what needed to happen. Jared had to take responsibility. He had to face the consequences of his actions. And that meant not relying on us to fix everything for him. For a long time, my wife had been trying to mediate between the brothers, holding on to the hope that she could somehow repair what had been broken. But she realized that forcing reconciliation would only cause more harm. So she made a decision: she was stepping back. We both agreed Jared needed to figure this out on his own. We told him that while we still loved him, we couldn't make things right for him. He had to face the reality of what he had done and start making amends on his own terms. There was no shortcut, no quick fix. This entire situation had been agonizing, but I have to admit the responses from people online, the advice and perspectives, had been invaluable. It helped us see things clearly, to understand that as much as we loved Jared, we couldn't shield him from the mess he created. We were still navigating this painful journey, but one thing was certain: we had to do what was best for everyone, even if that meant making difficult choices. Update 2. A couple of days after my conversation with Simon, Jared showed up at our doorstep again. But this time, he wasn't just looking for forgiveness. He was looking for a place to stay. He looked rough, disheveled, exhausted, like the weight of the world had finally settled onto his shoulders. Whatever arrogance or confidence he had before was gone. When he stepped inside, I could tell right away that something was seriously wrong. And then, after a long pause, he admitted the truth. Tessa had taken everything. She had drained his bank account, wiped out his savings, and vanished with another man, leaving him with nothing. He was broke, unable to pay his rent, and now, with nowhere else to go, he had come to us, hoping, maybe even expecting, that we would take him in. But I couldn't do it. I didn't want him in my house. After everything he had done, the pain, the chaos, the destruction he left in his wake, the last thing I wanted was to welcome him back like nothing had happened. And yet, as much as I wanted to turn him away, I knew that whatever decision I made next would change everything. My wife, being the kind-hearted woman she is, insisted that we couldn't just turn our backs on Jared, not when he was in such a desperate state. She didn't excuse his actions, not for a second, but seeing him like that, disheveled, lost, completely broken, brought out the mother in her. It was hard for her to look at the man he had become and reconcile it with the bright, ambitious son we had once raised. After some back and forth, I reluctantly agreed to let him stay, but under strict conditions. If we were going to take him in, he had to make things right. He had to put serious effort into apologizing to Simon and Melanie, especially Melanie. From what we had heard through her family, she was struggling to piece her life back together. The betrayal had hit her hard, and she was still carrying the weight of what Jared had done. Melanie had always been a kind, gentle person, someone who gave far more than she ever took. She hadn't deserved any of this. We made it clear to Jared his stay with us would only be temporary, and it came with expectations. If he wanted our help, he needed to show genuine remorse and start making amends. He nodded, promised he would do everything we asked. He assured us he would reach out to both Simon and Melanie, apologize sincerely, and take the first steps toward fixing the damage he had caused. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to hope. Maybe this was it. Maybe he had finally reached rock bottom and was ready to take responsibility for his actions. But that hope didn't last long. Within 2 days, it was painfully obvious that Jared hadn't changed at all. Instead of making an effort to repair the relationships he had destroyed, he spent his time lounging on our couch, flipping through channels, scrolling mindlessly on his phone like he didn't have a care in the world. There was no urgency, no guilt, no sign that he even understood how deep of a hole he had dug himself into. He didn't reach out to Simon. He didn't reach out to Melanie. He didn't even try. It was as if none of it had ever happened, like he was just waiting for the next opportunity to come along. I watched in growing frustration as Jared wasted the little time we had given him. He wasn't trying to make things right, he was just looking for a free place to crash. He had no interest in fixing what he had broken. I couldn't take it anymore. I confronted him. I told him, bluntly, that we had expected more from him. That we had taken him in under the assumption that he would take responsibility for his actions, but instead, he was treating our home like a free hotel. To my surprise, my wife, who had been the more sympathetic one, had reached her breaking point, too. She looked at Jared, disappointment written all over her face, and told him the hard truth. It was clear he wasn't ready to face the consequences of his actions. And if he wasn't willing to take his situation seriously, he didn't deserve to stay under our roof. We didn't waste any more time. We told him to pack his things and leave within the hour. He wasn't welcome back until he had made genuine efforts to apologize, not just empty words, but real, meaningful attempts to repair the damage he had done. And we weren't taking his word for it either. Until we heard directly from Simon and Melanie that he was truly making amends, our doors would remain closed. Jared just stood there, stunned. I don't think he ever expected us to take such a firm stance. Maybe he had assumed that, no matter what, we would always be there to catch him when he fell. But we had reached our limit. We couldn't enable his reckless behavior anymore. Not this time. After Jared left, it didn't take long before the messages started pouring in. Within hours, he was calling, texting, leaving voicemails, all filled with the same desperate refrain. Hundreds of apologies, one after another. He pleaded for another chance, insisted that he finally understood, that he had truly learned his lesson this time. But we knew better. This wasn't the first time Jared had made empty promises. This was a pattern. He would mess up, apologize profusely, and then, as soon as the pressure eased, fall right back into his old habits. We had been through this cycle before. So we told him the truth. We weren't the ones who needed to hear his apologies. His words meant nothing unless they were directed at the people he had truly hurt, Simon and Melanie. We were done endorsing his reckless, free-spirited behavior. Done letting him drift through life without facing real consequences. It was time for him to grow up, to take responsibility, to understand that his choices had real, lasting consequences for the people around him. In the meantime, my wife and I turned our attention to the people who actually deserved our support, Simon and Melanie. They were the ones who had been wronged. They were the ones still picking up the pieces of their lives while Jared had been busy pretending like none of it mattered. We couldn't undo what had happened, but we could be there for them. And that was exactly what we intended to do. Update 3. A lot has happened over the past few days, and I wanted to share an update. First and foremost, my wife and I made a decision. It was time to step in and give Simon some much-needed support. We could see how much he was struggling. Between working, raising his kids, and trying to heal from everything that had happened, the weight on his shoulders was unbearable. He was exhausted, mentally and physically, but he refused to acknowledge just how much he needed help. So we went to his place and insisted that we take the kids for a week or two. At first, Simon resisted. He didn't want to be apart from them, not even for a short while. He had been holding on to them like a lifeline, convinced that if he let go, even for a second, he might fall apart. But we knew that hiding behind responsibility wasn't a long-term solution. Yes, his kids gave him purpose, but that didn't mean he didn't need time to breathe. Time to focus on himself. Time to process everything without the constant demands of fatherhood weighing him down. So we didn't take no for an answer. We reassured him that the kids would be safe, happy, and well cared for. That this wasn't about taking them away, it was about giving him the space he needed to heal. Eventually, after a long conversation, he agreed. I could see the hesitation in his eyes, the guilt of accepting help, but I also saw something else, relief. For the first time in a long time, he had a chance to put himself first. And for that, I was grateful. We don't know what the future holds, but one thing is certain: Simon deserves peace. And we're going to do everything we can to help him find it. After some convincing, Simon finally agreed, though not without hesitation. Letting go, even for a short time, wasn't easy for him. Those kids were his entire world, his anchor, the one thing keeping him grounded. But deep down, I think he knew this was the right choice. He needed the space to breathe, to process everything without the constant weight of responsibility pressing down on him. So my wife and I took the kids home with us, hoping to give Simon the time he so desperately needed. Then, something unexpected happened. Jared showed up at Simon's door. We had been expecting this moment, knowing that sooner or later, Jared would have to face his brother and attempt to make amends. But when it finally happened, it was anything but smooth. Simon's reaction was instant, pure, raw anger. Seeing Jared standing there, the same brother who had torn his life apart, was more than he could handle. The tension was thick, the kind that could snap at any second. They nearly came to blows right then and there, and I won't lie, things got heated. But then something surprising happened. For the first time, Jared didn't try to talk his way out of it. He didn't deflect, didn't offer excuses or justifications. He stood there and took it, letting Simon unleash every bit of anger he had been holding in for months. And when Simon was finally done, when his voice was hoarse from shouting, Jared spoke. He admitted that he had screwed up. That he deserved whatever punishment Simon had in mind. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't try to spin the situation in his favor. He just acknowledged, plainly and simply, that he had messed up in a way he could never take back. That was when things shifted. Instead of throwing Jared out, Simon, after a long, intense argument, agreed to have a civil conversation. It was during that talk that Jared finally opened up. He told Simon everything about what had happened since Tessa left him, how she had drained his accounts, stolen every cent he had, and disappeared without a trace. How he was completely broke, without a way to support himself, and didn't know where to turn. Simon was conflicted. On one hand, Jared had brought this on himself. He had made his choices, and now he was facing the consequences. But on the other hand, hearing how Tessa had scammed him didn't sit right with Simon. As much as he wanted to be done with his brother, as much as he had every right to walk away, he couldn't ignore the fact that Tessa had done to Jared exactly what Jared had done to him. So, despite everything, Simon made a decision. He told Jared to meet him at our house the next day. When Simon and Jared walked through our door together, my wife and I were surprised, but also relieved. It was the first time we had seen them in the same room since everything had fallen apart. And while they weren't suddenly best friends again, there was something different, a sense of understanding, however fragile it was. Then Simon did something I never expected. Remember how Tessa had been reaching out to Simon, trying to make amends? Well, Simon decided to use that to his advantage. Right there, in our living room, he pulled out his phone and called her. Naturally, Tessa answered right away, probably thinking this was her big chance to smooth things over. But Simon wasted no time on pleasantries. He got straight to the point. He told her that he was sitting with Jared, that he knew exactly what she had done, and that if she didn't return the money she had stolen within the next 2 days, they were going to the police to press charges for theft. Her response was instant. She started stuttering, scrambling to backtrack and make excuses. She tried to apologize, to spin another one of her manipulative stories. But Simon wasn't having it. He made it clear her apologies meant nothing. She had already caused enough damage, and this was her one and only warning. She had 48 hours. After that, there would be no more talking. Then, without another word, he hung up. For the first time in a long time, Simon was in control. He wasn't just reacting to the situation, he was setting boundaries, refusing to let Tessa manipulate him anymore. And in that moment, something changed. Simon and Jared sat down again, this time not as enemies, but as two people who had both been hurt by the same person. They weren't suddenly brothers again. Their relationship was still far from repaired. But they had a common goal, and for now, that was enough. In the days that followed, we kept a close eye on the situation. Jared stayed away from our house, as we had agreed, focusing on sorting out his own mess. My wife and I turned our attention to the grandkids, making sure they felt as much normalcy as possible despite the chaos surrounding them. It hasn't been easy. But seeing Simon take charge of his life again, even in small ways, gave us hope that maybe, just maybe, things were starting to move in the right direction. Just as Simon had planned, within 48 hours, Jared was able to recover most of the money Tessa had taken. It wasn't the full amount, but it was enough to bring a sense of relief to everyone involved. Jared was visibly emotional, tears streaming down his face as he thanked Simon repeatedly for his help. He admitted that he hadn't expected Simon to step up for him, not after everything he had done. But he promised, this time, he would put in the effort to make things right. And while Simon still wasn't ready to forgive him, this was a step. A small, uncertain step towards something resembling closure. It didn't erase the betrayal. It didn't undo the hurt. But it gave Simon reassurance that he had handled the situation with integrity. That he had done everything in his power to address the damage, not just sit back and let it consume him. Now, he can focus on moving forward. On rebuilding his life. On being the father his kids need. And we'll be right there beside him, every step of the way. We've reminded him again that he doesn't have to carry this burden alone. That we'll always be there to help with the kids, to support him however we can. Because if there's one thing this entire experience has taught us, it's that Family Real family is about more than just blood. It's about the people who stand by you when everything else falls apart. And while we don't know exactly how things will play out from here, we're taking it one day at a time. Together. Final thoughts. I just want to take a moment to thank everyone who has followed this journey, who has offered advice and support. The insight from this community has been invaluable, helping us see things from different perspectives and giving us the strength to make difficult decisions. We're still navigating this mess, but with each passing day, we're finding a little more clarity. So, from the bottom of my heart, thank you.